And there's kind of a effort by a bunch of people who had way more power and influence over decisions throughout the campaign, first under the Biden campaign and then under the Harris campaign, to kind of shift blame to people who have none of that level of power or resources or decision-making authority.
Hello, friends, and thank you for joining us on Charting the Way Forward, where we deliver research-informed strategy and intelligence from across the Democratic coalition. This podcast is produced by Way to Win, where we aim to upend politics as usual. I'm your host, Kerry Eleveld, and today we have a very special guest, co-executive director of the National Action Group Indivisible, which is once again proving to be indispensable to the Trump resistance. Leah Greenberg, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Great to be here.
All right. Well, let's get into it. It's just the two of us today. Sometimes we have a few people and whatever, but we got lots to cover with Leah. Because after weeks of inaction by congressional Democrats, we are finally starting to see some signs of life. Opposing Musk's lawless takeover of the federal government, including the Treasury Department, Education Department, USAID, with all of the sensitive data that Musk wants to plunder for his own, probably his own pocketbook, his own purposes. Indivisible played an essential role in rousing Democrats from their slumber. Leah, did you all anticipate the sort of initial lethargy and hesitancy from the Democrats, especially congressional Democrats? And what was your strategy for activating them?
Well, we did a lot of planning in advance of the election and over the last couple of months. And one of the things that we anticipated was that a Trump win would lead to a period of kind of Dems in the wilderness, for lack of a better term. That there would be, there would obviously be infighting amongst folks within the party in the immediate aftermath, trying to make sense of the loss, but that actually pretty similar to 2016, there would be sort of this internal conversation about how much are we framing ourselves as working with Donald Trump versus framing ourselves as opposing Donald Trump. And our position was always pretty clear, which is that this isn't really even ideological. It's not a matter of whether you are left or right. It's a matter of whether you have a consistent analysis of who Donald Trump is, who his coalition is, what his aims and goals are, that would lead you to be really clear that there's just no finding common ground with a guy who believes he can govern as a dictator and who intends to come for everything that we care about. So we were pretty clear from early on, both that this would be the nature of the Trump presidency and that part of what we would need to do early on is give Democrats the energy and the support and the positive and negative reinforcement to fight. We knew that was going to be and just to be honest, that was true in 2016 as well. A big part of why we wrote our original Indivisible guide, which kicked off the formation of Indivisible groups around the country, was not just that we were horrified by what was happening or horrified by Donald Trump, but that we were alarmed that there wasn't immediate, clear leadership and resistance from Democrats. A big part of why we wrote it was actually seeing Chuck Schumer talking about maybe we can work together on infrastructure on the same day that a Trump nominee was talking about internment camps, right? So this is not a new phenomenon. It has always been the case that Democrats are going to look for, reinforcement, for backing, for a sense of the energy coming from the grassroots as they find their footing. And so we definitely started with the assumption that this would be part of the plan, as well as, of course, pushing hard on Republicans, right? Because fundamentally, they are the ones who are enabling this.
Yeah, right, right. Well, it's interesting. Okay, let's just back up a second because you said, there was the initial lethargy, right? But we did have some outpouring of things like the Women's March, right?
Right.
The pink pussycats, pussy hats all over the mall and, sort of eclipsing Donald Trump's inauguration. So what has changed, like in the arc of what's happening and the energy that you get from your groups? And what you're doing, has it changed considerably or is it really exactly the same?
I would say there are a number of things that are quite similar. The big difference to my mind is about shock, right? In 2016, this was a shock to a lot of people. And there was a sense of, oh, he won he won the electoral college, but he didn't win the popular vote. This is a fluke. What we need to do is make popular opposition very visible as fast as possible in order to front load the backlash that elected officials are going to experience and, steel them against him. And that was kind of, the big theory behind a lot of the early mobilizations, right? If I'm not sure everybody would have framed it in exactly those terms, but that was a big part of the way that that manifested. This time around, people aren't shocked, right? Donald Trump's been on the scene for 8 years. We're all really clear that he is part of a political movement that has long roots in American history, that is going to outlast him personally, that is here in a way that we have to combat for the longer term. And so what we experienced immediately after the election was, people were very sad, right? But they weren't shocked. They were just kind of grimly resolved. And so, even like in the first week immediately afterwards, we expected maybe some people would step back, they'd be too disheartened. That wasn't what we experienced at all. We had an immediate influx of people who were coming in, folks who had been active a few years ago had stepped back, new people, people who had gotten active in the Kamala Harris wave over the summer and who were just rolling right over into ongoing activism. Really, basically, since November, we have been inundated with new people. In November, we broke the record for the most new Indivisible groups formed in a month. And then we broke it again in December and again in January. And it is February 12th. And we already have the most Indivisible groups formed this month than ever before. So, what we're
Wow.
seeing consistently is people kind of skipped the shock phase and they went straight into the organizing locally to figure something out about how they could fight back phase. And so, for a lot of people, because there wasn't the big visible public pushback, there was an assumption that there wasn't actually a ton going on in the actual infrastructure of the grassroots. And the reality was, from November on, we saw an enormous amount of local organizing that was always going to show up at the national level sooner or later.
That's great. Well, how many chapters do you have now?
So we have about 400 new chapters since the election.
Wow, impressive. That's amazing. So 400 new, and then what does that mean total nationwide?
About 1,200 total nationwide.
Wow, that's
And
amazing.
I should clarify, indivisible groups are informal volunteer grassroots pop-ups. So they go through various forms of like high levels of activity. They go on summer for a little while. We're always trying to verify how many folks are actually active at any given moment, but there's a significantly larger number if you conclude the groups across the map or across the country.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. Well, that and 400 is an impressive amount of organizing in a short amount of time. Um, okay, so you guys have made a lot of news. You jammed you were part of an effort to help jam the phone lines when, congressional Democrats were like playing a possum and saying, I don't know, maybe we should bipartisanship is really popular these days. Um, Yesterday, Axios had a scoop, what they call a scoop. And here's the headline. Dems, quote unquote, pissed at liberal groups move on slash indivisible. Did you see this
We did see
scoop?
this, yes.
Okay, okay. So let me read from just a touch of it so people get a flavor. A closed door meeting for House Democrats this week included a gripe fest directed at liberal grassroots organizations, sources tell Axios. Why it matters. Members of the Steering and Policy Committee with Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries in the room on Monday complained that activist groups like Move On and Indivisible have facilitated thousands of phone calls to members' offices. Hearings from constituents is awful. That's my own input. Anyway, people are pissed, said a senior House Democrat. And then he went on to say that the Democrat said that Jeffries himself is, quote unquote, very frustrated at the groups who are trying to stir up a more confrontational opposition to Trump. Okay, so I just wonder, like, when you see something like that, what do you think? What's your response to that?
Well, I guess what I would say first is it's Axios and it is a lot of anonymous quotes, right? And
Fair,
anytime
fair.
like there are anonymous quotes saying that someone else is feeling something that, and nobody involved is going on the record and it's being kind of written up in the buzziest possible terms, I think it's easy to get spun up. And that's not super productive. Like I
That's
think that
fair.
the vast majority of elected officials like understand that what they are seeing is a big wave of pain and fear and outrage
Yep.
from their constituents and really are trying to figure out how can they actually be responsive to that? How can they, how can they make sure that constituents understand that they have an ally in their elected officials? And so, what we've been advising folks is really think about what are the tools available to you. Those are different based on whether you're in the Senate or in the House, both to make clear that this is a crisis, to make clear that you feel that same level of concern and alarm, and to also prepare and think about how do you use your leverage, right? In the Senate, we've been urging folks to use a set of procedural maneuvers to try to slow things down. We understand that there's not a lot you can do when you're in the minority to ultimately stop some of these confirmations, right? You need to flip 4 Republican votes. We're not seeing those 4 Republicans come online yet, or those 4 Republicans flip yet. But you can, do things like the Democrats did last week with the vote nomination, where they used all 30 hours to speak out on the vote nomination to slow things down, et cetera. You can try and move away from business as usual, right? You can signal with the things that you are doing that we are in a crisis, that we are not in a kind of standard normal honeymoon period. And so that's what we've been asking. And I think we are seeing more Democrats really move into that orientation, both because they're getting this feedback from constituents, but also because every week that passes, we have more information about what Donald Trump and Elon Musk are doing and how incredibly sinister and dangerous it is.
Right, right. Um, okay, so I mean, I will just say progress has been made, but like this morning, Tulsi Gabbard, who's a former Democrat, but like I I think there's questions about her, certainly her ties abroad and whether or not, I mean, it's been floated, not verified, that like maybe she's a Russian asset. I don't know. But she's been confirmed this morning to be, the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, right? It has access to all sorts of sensitive information,
Yeah.
arguably potentially more dangerous than like Pete Hegseth at the Department of Defense. So like Democrats just kind of like let it happen. I mean, they probably weren't going to be able to stop this nomination, but they just kind of let it go through without a lot of pushback. I mean, what do you think about something like that?
Well, look, I think that we saw Democrats take to the floor for an extended period of time speaking on this nomination. We saw them hold united as a caucus, which we haven't been able to do for some of the previous nominations. And I'd want to see that continue for additional nominees, right? Um, and just generally what I would say is I think we should be really clear about like when we have leverage, what are we asking people to do and are they doing those things, right? We aren't going to be able, nominations are not subject to the filibuster. So there's not a way to like drag it out forever as the minority, but you can kind of message and frame and push back in ways that get attention. Now, I think that the thing that I will say on the nominee is I think there's kind of like, are you pushing back on the most bad, are the most terrible ones? But then there's also like, are you voting to oppose the ones that are not necessarily obviously terrible on their face because they are very clearly being brought on to implement an incredibly dangerous agenda, right? The way that you signal that something is emergency is not that you oppose a bad nominee. You should just oppose a bad nominee because they're bad, right? The way that you signal that it's emergency is you say, look, maybe Marco Rubio would be a totally normal Secretary of State under normal circumstances. He is coming on board to do Donald Trump's bidding, which means that the first thing that he's doing when he gets in is he's presiding over the destruction of USAID. So actually saying like this entire set of people is coming on board to fulfill the lawless agenda of Donald Trump is a different order entirely.
Right, right. Okay, let's step back a second because we've been talking about some nitty-gritty, but like let's get a little bit big picture. And then I do want to get into what's going to happen when Trump starts to actually try to, and Republicans start to actually try to legislate, because I'm sure that's a big target and something you've put a lot of thinking into. But like just in terms of the election and Democrats, are you getting the sense that people in Washington are misreading or have misread what happened in the election?
Yeah. So what I would say is that I think there are important lessons to take from the election, and I think we're in danger of rapidly overlearning them or applying them in ways that are actually going to be counterproductive. So I think one thing that a lot of us agree is that fundamentally, at core, this was part of a broad global backlash against incumbents who were associated with the post-COVID rise in inflation, right? We've seen a global wave of incumbents losing vote share in elections in 2024 and kind of a general and that frankly it was just very challenging for Kamala Harris to make enough headway in the face of the deep unpopularity of President Biden heading in, right? So those pieces I think are clear. Where I think that Democrats are kind of going a little bit, where I think things are going a little sideways here is obviously lower prices are central to people's like to how people feel about the situation. Obviously, a big part of what we're seeing as a valid attack on Donald Trump is he promised to lower prices and instead he's going and doing all of these crazy, horrible, chaotic things, and your prices are still rising, right? What we've seen with Democrats for the first couple of months was that the way they tried to operationalize that was that they were actually kind of steering away from anything they perceived as not working in the 2024 election, right? Anything about threats to democracy, anything about threats to reproductive freedom or social issues. They were kind of steering away from that stuff in favor of just saying to everything Donald Trump did, how will that lower prices? And I think one, that assumes that people have the same standards for an incumbent president who is actually putting their agenda into operation as they do for a challenger candidate in a period where they're very dissatisfied with the status quo. I think that is absolutely not a given. But two, I also think that uh, it's not in line with how the current info ecosystem is working, right? Because I think it is a strategy, it is a messaging strategy that is optimized for an era when everyone consumes a newspaper. The newspaper runs a story about what has happened. The story talks about what Donald Trump did, and then they always give a paragraph to Democrats to issue their rebuttal, right? And that's like the way that messaging was constructed, 20 years ago, right? But in an algorithmic world where you have to say something interesting, you're not guaranteed a right of reply. Nobody has to carry your message for you if they don't think that it's compelling. You actually have to be punchy. You have to get out there. You have to say something that captures people's imaginations if you want to be heard at all.
Right. Okay. So this is interesting because so one of the, I think what I hear you saying, but I just want to repeat it back. One of the questions I had for you is that one of the upsides of Donald Trump and of opposing him and downsides at the same time is that it's just a really target rich environment, right? You end up having the inflation is coming up. Let's see where I have this down. Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, like, first of all, you've got Shadow President Elon Musk. His popularity is dropping like a rock as we speak. Inflation is up for the first time since June. A CBS survey this week showed that 66% of voters don't think Trump is putting enough focus on lowering prices, which is a main reason that a lot of people held their noses to elect him. A recent Navigator poll found that by a 2-to-1 margin, Americans are concerned Trump will go too far rather than not far enough. So I was going to ask you, and like it kind of feeds into what you're saying. I mean, maybe you just think this is but if you were going to go out every day and hammer Trump on a single issue, what would it be? Or given what you just said, would the main thing be punchy no matter what you're talking about?
I think it's certainly the latter, just as a best practice. And I think that we gotta stick to some core themes that we're continuing to hit and linking the outrage of the day back to, right? I think there is a very clear strategic imperative around Elon Musk and toxifying Musk and his role in the federal government. All of the preliminary research and polling that we have access to suggests that this is an extremely high potential opportunity situation that Americans do not like the idea of the world's richest man taking control of the federal treasury and personally deciding whether your Medicaid or Social Security payments go through. So that is absolutely like a very clear strategic imperative. And, I don't think we know enough about the relationship between Donald Trump and Elon Musk and kind of who is the senior partner and who is the junior partner in that coalition right now. We don't really know how possible it is for that alliance to actually fracture, but either we're able to put some dents in that alliance, or we have an extraordinarily rich vein of material that we're able to go after Republicans for enabling if we're successfully doing that. And it's also just important because we just really need to make sure that that effort overall is understood to be a fundamentally illegitimate power grab crime spree,
Mhm.
not a good faith effort at actually reforming government. So that's one piece. I think the other piece that we've seen a lot of natural territory around is chaos, right? That Donald Trump is focused on Donald Trump, that Donald Trump is random, that he is chaotic, that he creates a lot of harm and damage and swirl. as opposed to actually doing anything particularly useful for regular people. And so being able to kind of consistently link all of the sense of overwhelm itself back to a story about, this is not what you actually signed up for, that's going to be really important as well.
Okay. Okay. So let's talk a little, let's turn to the legislating part because, there isn't much that, I mean, Democrats could slow down the gears a little bit on these nominations, but without Republicans buying into this guy's trying to, this guy's, it's an autocratic takeover and we can't confirm some of these, some of the most pernicious sort of players in this landscape. But like we can, assuming that the filibuster holds up, we can have an impact. And even in the House with the very slim House Republican majorities, we can have an impact in what they're able to get through, right? So in 2017, just I mean, a lot of people probably know this, but I just want to make sure they're clear. Indivisible activists became just like the tip of the spear on beating back Republican efforts to defeat Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, whatever you call it. It's the same thing. That failed effort was literally the lowest moment of Trump's first term in terms of his approval ratings. The same went for the Republicans in Congress. It was an incredibly low moment for them. So, what legislative targets are you eyeing now and tactics too as we prepare for Republicans to move into legislating mode, which frankly isn't really their strong suit?
Yeah, a great question. Well, I'd say there are a few different things that are coming up, right? Most immediately, there is a budget, there's a deadline for passing a budget March 15th. That is a place where Republicans have historically struggled and turned to Democrats for votes because they cannot manage a cohesive governing coalition within their own party, right? And all the evidence suggests that that is what they're going to do again here. I think that's a place where Democrats need to be really thoughtful about, like, essentially what will stop the crime spree here, right? Like if they're being asked for their votes to help Republicans manage their own coalition, solve their own problem, what are we asking that actually helps to get at this ongoing, unconstitutional power grab? Um, Following that, there's obviously reconciliation, and there might be two reconciliation packages or one reconciliation package over the course of this year. Republicans are still debating. The Senate has
And
a preference.
let me just clarify reconciliation
Reconciliation,
for
yes, sorry.
listeners,
Sorry,
right?
sorry.
Because if they put the things that they put that are reconciliation bills are supposed to be fiscally related to the budget, et cetera, and you can't filibuster them. They can get that through with a bare majority. So it's a little different than like other legislative packages. So I think what they're trying to do, what Republicans will want to do, is pack as much into a reconciliation bill as they can so that they don't have to deal with a filibuster in the Senate. Okay, go ahead, please.
That's
Sorry
right.
about that.
That's right. And there's a debate about whether that means you can do up to two reconciliation packages. There's a debate about doing two different ones or trying to pack everything into one bill and pass it all together. That's not been resolved yet. But fundamentally, this is the vehicle by which they will attempt to extend the Trump tax cuts from his first term, which are coming up. This is the vehicle by which they will attempt to gut various parts of the social safety net to pay for that. This is the vehicle that they're probably going to put a bunch of their other, priorities as it relates to budget, as it relates to, say, the IRA, as it relates to immigration. All of that they are likely to pack into that reconciliation package.
Right. So what do you do with that? I mean, and here's the other thing. What we've already seen, and correct me if this has changed, but there's some thinking that Republicans will try to put aid to a state like California, the aid for Los Angeles and the fires there, right? Some sort of federal aid, disaster relief in that bill in order to try to suck Democrats into voting for it because they're saying otherwise, we're just going to hold back federal relief to the most populous state in the nation that probably contributes more to federal coffers than any other single state. That's what the position of the Trump administration is.
Yep. I mean, look, I think one of the very clear themes of the Trump administration, and it's, we knew it was coming and it's been very, very dominant, is the attempt to use federal dollars to compel everyone in the country to go along with their agenda, right? You see that running through the federal funding freeze. You see that running through all of the EOs on DEI. You see that running through the threats that they're making around sanctuary cities. You see that running through the California disaster aid. And I think what we've got to be really clear on is that this is a slippery slope. Any individual effort around this, people, and again, this goes to kind of whether Democrats are going to collectively hang together. Any individual effort here, you might have some people who split off because of whatever reason. And also the validation of the idea that the executive can like simply withhold funding from states based on a political disagreement or in order to advance their own personal political gains. We simply can't let that, we can't start down that slope. It's incredibly dangerous if we do.
Okay, so that's just an absolute no on that. Because am I wrong? We probably have the best chance of stopping that bill in the House. Is that true?
Well, so I think we should talk about it in terms of like what we can achieve with various stages, right? So in
Okay.
the House, our goal, first of all, is and is to hold Democrats together, right? And force the Republicans to spend this time fighting each other. Because there is, I mean, we all know this. We've all lived through multiple years of headlines about the fractious Republican caucus, but they're a shit show. And am I allowed to say that? They're a shit show.
Yes, of course.
So
We endorse it. Shit show. I'm down with it. Yeah.
Um, and they are not capable of coming up with a package that they are all collectively aligned on. And so as long as we are able to hold united as a Democratic caucus, that means an extended period of disalignment and headlines that are about, Republicans can't agree on exactly how much of your benefits they should cut, right? Because fundamentally, there's a group of people who will try to get offsets, who will try to ensure that the tax cuts are being paid for by cuts to Medicaid, right? By all kinds of really draconian cuts to programs that Americans depend on. We need to be really hopping on all of those moments and making sure people understand that this is a fight about taking away from regular people in order to hand massive additional giveaways to billionaires and corporations. So I think the first piece is just kind of unity around among Democrats in order to extend the amount of time that Republicans are forced to kind of push, fight with each other.
Yeah. I think that's great. I mean, it's kind of like let's just let them simmer in their own stew for as long as possible by making sure that Democrats just remain united and oppositional. And so that's great. Okay. Let me move on to something that's a little bit more like a positioning thing for Democrats. Billionaires are taking up a lot of space in the news these days. We've got one who shows up in the Oval Office all the time, is running a shadow presidency. Um, a recent poll found that like 12% of voters favor the idea, just 12%, just a mere 12% favor the idea of Trump getting advice from Elon Musk on how to run the government, and yet there he is, basically doing it. But like Democrats also have their own billionaires. I mean, Republicans have famously, gone after like George Soros and people like that for forever. And the Democratic Party chair, Ken Martin, has even gotten into what is a little bit of a pretzel twisting thing where he's talked about there's a distinction between like good billionaires and bad billionaires. Saying essentially the point there was that Democrats don't take money from the bad one. That just feels bad ones. That just feels like pretty unsatisfying. So how should Democrats be positioning themselves vis-a-vis billionaires and all the money that's in the system, especially when we're talking about, some people refer to as an oligarchy takeover, or some people, or some people talk about the billionaire class or billionaires in general. Like, how do we sort of, talk about this and not have the comeback all the time that's like, well, you guys do it too.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, without going into like an ex super extensive discussion of like the focus grouping around billionaires, my personal instincts are that you really want to start from the place of how is it directly harming regular people and work backwards to tell the story, right? And that is a story about, like the ways in which corporate capture, the ways in which the billionaire class are systematically polluting the political sphere, in or corrupting the political sphere in service of their own interests in ways that have directly damaging implications for you personally. Um, I think there is I think there's a tendency to kind of frame it just in terms of, oh, all the billionaires, right? But I actually think we have to be really concrete for people because, there are folks who like have a generally like who have an aspirational attitude towards wealth, right? Like, one of the things that we've found that has been incredibly difficult with Donald Trump and messaging around him is that basic association of he's very wealthy, therefore he's good with money has stuck for a very long time for a lot of people. And so we need to make sure that it's not just about kind of the amount of wealth, but it's actually about the concrete impacts that wealth is having on our democracy. And we need to go to something that I think Way to Win has done a really good job of talking about, which is that, it's not necessarily that we don't have policies that people like. People like democratic policies. They don't believe that Democrats are going to do those things necessarily, right? That's the often the rub. And so I think when in a period where we're out of power and we have a chance to kind of brand and show what we care about, what we're prepared to do, we should be asking ourselves, what are we capable of doing that show people that we're actually serious about delivering on our promises? I think one thing that I've personally thought about is, um, there's always there's this constant tendency for Congress to bring up and then fail to pass a stock ban on or a insider stock trading ban for members of Congress. There is absolutely nothing stopping Democratic members of Congress from kind of independently verifying that they are opting out of it, and, that they are not going to be trading stocks, right? What can we do to actually show people that we're not part of what they perceive to be a broadly corrupt and, system in which everyone is in on it?
Right, right. Let me just get back to something you said. So do you think that the main reason that we are not getting purchased sometimes, Democrats are not getting purchased sometimes with voters, is simply that they don't believe Democrats will deliver? Or is it sometimes I look at this like grab basket of, economic policies. Kamala had plenty of them that were going to help people buy homes, help people, help people with childcare, help people like is it is this like do we need something bigger? I mean, I know at Way to Win we think we do need a bigger economic message. We need something that but we believe that. But I'm asking you because you're like kind of on the front lines. So
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely agree. I think that people, we'd like it if people just looked at a list of policies and said, "Oh, I like these ones, so I'm voting that way." But, people understand the world through stories. They understand, they take individual facts and they hook them into the broader story that helps them make sense of things. And the Republican story is really clear. It's like the following sets of people are to blame for your personal conditions, right? Um, that is not nearly as clear or coherent or consistent across the Democratic side. So I'm very much in alignment that I think part of the answer here is about having a clear economic story. But I do think that we also just have to be real about the fact that a lot of the people that we're struggling to reach, it's not necessarily that we're struggling, we're not in the right place ideologically. It's that they don't trust politics in general. They don't like it very much. They are not paying very much attention. They are not absorbing or paying attention to the same news sources that we, by virtue of people being people who are interested, are paying attention to. And we have to figure out ways to reach them that break through the kind of pervasive cynicism and frustration with the political system that they perceive as, they perceive as corrupt on all sides.
do you feel like there's a new opportunity here, given the fact that, I mean, Trump's going to break government, right? Payments aren't going to be made. Head Start programs aren't going to, provide childcare, all that stuff. Like, is there an opportunity to swoop in, and is it just going to be reinforcing that government can't work for us, or is there going to be an opportunity like with a bunch of local organizing to get people involved and, you know, help them feel the power of their own agency?
Yeah. I think it's a great question. I think a lot depends on how they do the next steps and whether they get smarter about kind of going with a scalpel as opposed to going with a hammer. I think that what you saw, for example, with the 36 hours of the federal funding freeze is it is absolutely possible to go far enough that you incite the kind of massive and immediate backlash that you have to take a step back. And I think what you would see if you look at the last 2 weeks is they took that step back, but they didn't, actually back off of the ultimate goal. They just switched to a strategy of inserting Elon Musk into various federal agencies and having him do it in a way that wasn't designed to attract quite as much immediate and collective public backlash. Now, I think that there's absolutely going to be a lot of opportunities for local organizing here. And I think there's also a lot of opportunities for unconventional allies, right? Because fundamentally, federal government programs touch a bunch of people who are not considered the traditionally part of kind of our coalition, right? And and in ways that you might not expect. I'm thinking right now of, for example, USAID and food aid, right? Where there are a bunch of American farmers who are not generally considered likely to be part of our coalition, but who are part of the infrastructure of providing food aid, famine relief to people all over the world, and whose shipments are currently sitting on docks and canceled for the foreseeable future. There are going to be a lot of situations where people who may or may not have had much of an analysis of how government directly impacted their life or, impacted their business or impacted something that they rely on are finding that out. And so I do think there are opportunities for figuring out how do you pull people in to a broad understanding that this is affecting all of us. Because what we don't want is a situation where they're kind of going through and carving out the places where Republicans are feeling pain and fixing those things and then just systematically going after the things that they think they can get away with.
Can I just follow up on that question? What kind of time do you have? Where are you in terms of time? Do you
Me?
feel like, yeah, are you like, I got to get to a meeting, or do you have
Oh
a
no, I
few
got
more
I got I
minutes?
got a few minutes. Yeah.
Okay, good. So I want to follow up on that question because, this isn't the first time that Trump policies have kind of, for lack of a better word, screwed a bunch of farmers, right? So I'm wondering if your answer, if you feel like you have more insight into how to reach those farmers with messages that like Trump did this. And what ended up in the last effort was in his first term is they ended up passing a bunch of subsidies in a bill to try to like make whole these farmers that got on the wrong end of tariffs and all that stuff, right? So is there those I don't think Trump lost very much support among those farmers ultimately. I mean, do you think differently? Do you have any different insights into how we might reach them with you do realize that Trump did this. You do realize that he doesn't care that you put millions into, certain things and now you can't get the revenue back, that type of thing.
I think that it's gonna have to be a process of trial and error, just to be honest. I do think that the kind of the scope and the ambition of the second term is categorically different than the first term and might have different ultimate impacts on different populations of people. Fundamentally, like the people who are coming in with Trump 2.0 view the first term as a failure for not having gone far enough, fast enough, in enough directions. And they're very clearly trying to correct that as we can all see. And so I'm not sure that we're necessarily looking at quite the same ability to collectively maintain the coalition. Although we are also seeing different versions of that, right? I think if you look at, say, Senator Britt, talking about how they need research funding restored for Alabama, but not how we need research funding restored for everyone, you can see the beginnings of efforts to kind of carve out maintaining a flow of resources to the Trump coalition without actually while gutting the infrastructure that keeps the rest of us safe and functional. So
Wow.
all which is just to say, I think it's going to be determined to some extent by the speed and the scope which they move. I also think that we need to look at kind of nonpartisan and big tent building efforts that bring people in based on some kind of set of common, very, very baseline shared commitments rather than necessarily full political alignment. Indivisible groups obviously are not are independent of the Democratic Party. We, are in local grassroots pop-up groups around the country. In some of the areas where we operate, our folks find that they are able to bring a bunch of people in who would not be attending your local Democratic Party meeting because they're able to say, we're independent. We call it as we see it. We're against big money in politics, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that there's room for kind of like, how do you actually reach people who maybe are not going to be collected under a partisan frame, but can be collected based on some set of principles about how government can and should work and, what lines should not be crossed. But it's going to require a lot of trial and error.
Right, right. Okay. So, I mean, I like that. I mean, this Trump 2.0 is not Trump 1.0, and they're hitting so much that there's going to be more opportunity in some ways for us if we think big about how to take advantage of those opportunities. Um, So I want to bring in, I have a couple more questions. One is, and I don't know if you've been treated to this, but like I listen to the focus group pretty regularly with Sarah Longwell. She recently had Adam Gentleson on her most recent episode. And Adam Gentleson, for those who don't know, has kind of been one of the ringleaders of he's a Democrat. He's worked for Senator Fetterman. He's worked for Harry Reid, in their offices. And he's been one of the ringleaders of sort of demonizing the left. And the title for Kamala Harris, specifically for Kamala Harris's loss, the idea that the groups made her go too far left, and that's the reason she lost. The title of this episode was "Winners Make Policy, Losers Go Home," which is kind of a famous Mitch McConnellism, right? That like doesn't matter how you win, once you win, you're in control and everybody else goes home. And the premise was kind of that Dems are losing because, quote unquote, the groups, right, care more about fighting moral and ethical battles than winning elections. Like, I think that's a fair characterization of what they were getting at. And I just wanted to I imagine that Indivisible would kind of fall into the groups. Way to Win would probably fall into the groups. I just, I don't know. The groups are, it's a loose definition, but I wonder what your response is to that premise that we're more interested in fighting more moral and ethical battles that might lead to Pyrrhic victories, but ultimately we lose elections on them.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's a super unproductive dynamic immediately after an election is that everybody who had a take before the election feels like the best way to get oxygen is to wedge that take into kind of a half-baked explanation of why that was the factor that determined the election. And I do think that's a significant part of what we're seeing with the group's discourse, right? Like this is a long-standing critique, and there's kind of a effort by a bunch of people who had way more power and influence over decisions throughout the campaign, first under the Biden campaign and then under the Harris campaign, to kind of shift blame to people who have none of that level of power or resources or decision-making authority. So I think we can have a bunch of conversations about like what is the role of various actors within the democratic ecosystem without validating the basic premise that this was some kind of story, this is like an actually meaningful factor in the election. Fundamentally, we had a wildly unpopular incumbent, and Vice President Harris did her best to try to outrun that, but was not set up for success by the conditions she was heading into. And I just think that, reaching back into, kind of it's a reach. I think more generally, a healthy democratic ecosystem is going to have a lot of activated people, and people come to the Democratic Party because they care about winning and they care about making sure that those wins turn into something concrete. What we've seen at Indivisible, right? We exist in large part because we gave people a space to organize locally that allowed them to both push for Democrats overwhelmingly, right? Because we are very clear that when it comes to a general election, we always go for the Democrat. We don't take our ball and go home. And also push to uphold their values, right? Because they got into this in order to make meaningful change and to stave off real harm. Um, I think that the idea that you can have that kind of thriving ecosystem if you simply treat them as people who are only who are only given a top-down directive is indicative of a lot of the challenges that the Democratic Party has had organizing, right? Um, the grassroots is not a vending machine. You don't just like pop in your activism order and get out your rallies or whatever. You have to be in an ongoing and engaged relationship with people for them to feel like they are part of something with you and for them to feel like it's worth investing your time. And that means delivering for people on policy as well. So I think the idea that you can kind of cut out the idea that you can have organized people power behind a party without actually having, any kind of infrastructure about actually delivering for what they care about. I just think it's half baked.
Gotcha. Okay. One last question. Um, you can choose. I have two last questions, but you can choose. What have you found most surprising since the election, or where do you draw inspiration? And extra credit if you can combine the two.
Uh, sure, I can do that. I will admit I was prepared for quite a significant degree of elite collapse in the immediate period after the election, and I was still surprised at the speed and the comprehensiveness of some of what happened, right? The world's most powerful and wealthy people raced to kiss Donald Trump's ring. And that is just a moral failure and an indictment of a bunch of things about our society, right? And the flip side of that is I have been heartened and inspired by how many people, regular people who have a lot more at risk personally, have been like, hell no, and have started organizing or kept organizing or doubled down on what they're doing. And, people who are in places where that's incredibly hard, people who are in places where that requires being uncomfortable, where that requires taking on new kinds of leadership. Um, there's something very, very terrible happening, but there is also something very beautiful happening too. And I feel very lucky to be in direct touch with the people who are carrying that charge and leading us forward.
Okay, A+ for that answer. She got them both in. Leah Greenberg, thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to hear from you.
Great to be here.
Okay. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. We appreciate your dedication to staying engaged in the work of rebuilding our democracy. We have been and will and keep encouraging you to find local ways to stay connected. Leah, actually, I always say this, stay connected locally, but what's the best way to find an Indivisible group near you?
You go to indivisible.org. We've got a sign up form and we will get you connected with a local group or we will help you to start your own if you are so motivated.
Fantastic. Action item right there. Autocratic authoritarian movements, they count on people feeling disconnected, alone, powerless. So it's super important, whatever you do, in whatever capacity you want, that you find meaningful points of connection close by in your local area. And if you appreciate what we're doing here on this podcast and our Substack, which is also called Charting the Way Forward, follow us, rate and review us. It's super helpful, and we would be thrilled to count you as part of our crew. You can also find Way to Win on Blue Sky, our social media home. We encourage you to join us there too. But for now, we'll see you next Thursday. Until then, do good, be well, hug your loved ones, and tell your dog I say hi.